And Mark, I mean, we talk about a stock market, I should say, kind of inching back towards those record highs. And that's in the face of all those rate hikes, that we got last year. Now sitting at 5.5%, at least on the top line. And investors now coming to terms with the fact that we're not going to get any rate cuts, at least not anytime soon. Why am I to believe, though, that that's going to be bad for the stock market?
Well, thanks, Romaine. Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here. So I think the first thing to note is that while there are periods when the market and interest rates are negatively correlated, in other words, when rates go down, the market goes up, that's not always been the case. So we can point to plenty of times in market cycles where the market has continued to go up in a flat or rising interest rate environment. And I think the reason for that is we're seeing, a lot of innovation, a lot of secular trends driving companies and sectors higher. And those trends are happening regardless of the interest rate environment, whether it's technology or healthcare or even in areas of consumer innovation. These forces are driving industries and sectors higher. Companies have got strong balance sheets and they're benefiting from that. So, we do think that, whereas we do think that rates will ultimately come down, we don't think that the market's going to be on hold until we get to that period.
Talk about some of those bigger themes. Obviously, AI was a big driver of market gains last year. You mentioned a couple others, including healthcare. What are you seeing there that is big, that is structural, that is thematic?
Well, in healthcare, we're really in a golden era of innovation and new drug formulation. I think last year the FDA approved 70 plus compounds, which was, I think, a record. And so clearly the R&D efforts of the large cap pharmaceutical companies, of biotech companies, are yielding much more positive results than they have in the past. I think AI is a part of that, and the fact that they're using technology to help them, figure out which compounds are going to be the winners and which are going to be the losers. And what we're seeing is that not only are we seeing new drug discovery, but these drugs are actually meeting unmet medical needs. And so whereas in the past, a lot of the new drug discovery was just another drug to treat cholesterol or high blood pressure, now we're seeing real breakthrough therapies that are meeting unmet medical needs. And there's probably no better example today than the GLP-1 inhibitors, or otherwise known as the weight loss drugs, that are having, real effects not only on obesity, but on all other corresponding diseases and symptoms that are part of obesity.
I also wonder, too, in terms of a structural shift in the economy, what do you make of utilities? Because the second best performing sector in the S&P this year are utilities, after communication services, which, let's be honest, is just technology. How do you understand that? Like, you could make an argument that's a defensive play, or is that actually a growth AI data center play, which, to your point, in terms of structural changes, is definitely a big one?
Yeah, so I think, look, utilities have typically been tied to economic growth. So, when we have looked at utilities at Janus Henderson, we typically look in regions where there's population growth, where there's industrial growth, and so there's essentially greater demand for electricity. But I think you're right. I think what is happening in terms of just the upward movement in the whole utility sector is people are realizing that these data centers are going to be incredibly power consumptive. But by the way, they're also going to be consuming a lot of water, which is something I don't think people have focused on. But the fact that we're going to need to generate so much power and electricity to basically power these data centers is what I think is one of the reasons utility stocks are going up.
Which then brings us back to the beginning of the conversation and sort of the soft indicators, ISM services, NFIB, the UMISH sentiment, they all go lower. Stock market can go higher because you're seeing these structural shifts regardless of any cyclicality. Is that a fair statement?
I think that is part of it. And talk about like the consumer and the fact that consumer sentiment has been a little bit weaker of late. When the consumer is cutting back, they're not cutting back on all parts of their spending. And we've seen a trend, for example, where consumers are definitely cutting back on buying material goods. They're trading down when they have the opportunity, but they're spending more in areas like leisure and travel, basically favoring, experiential spending over buying material goods. So I think that just speaks to the role of active management and being able to pick subsectors within an area that might, on the surface, look broadly weak, but where there are definitely pockets of strength and increased spending.